So much for joining us to celebrate strong winds and widowmakers, workers, nature, and environmental conflict in Pacific Northwest timber country. My name is Heather, and I'm the Senior Publicity Manager at the University of Illinois Press. And I'm just going to go over some brief logistical information and introduce our guests before we get started. First of all, thank you so much to Dr. Beda and Dr. Robbins for being here today. They're going to talk for about 45 minutes, and then we will have time for a 15-minute Q&A at the end. You can enter questions throughout the event at the bottom of your screen in the Q&A box. You can use promo code HOLIDAY22 to get a 50% discount on the book on the University of Illinois Press website. I'll put the promo code and a link to the book in the chat box. We will also be recording this event and posting it on our YouTube channel afterwards. You'll receive an email from Zoom after the event that will have both a discount code and a link to our YouTube channel as well. And now I will just briefly introduce our guests. Stephen Beda is an assistant professor of history at the University of Oregon. He teaches courses on 20th century U.S. history, labor history, environmental history, and the history of the Pacific Northwest. His research explores the history of timber workers in the Pacific Northwest. His book, Strong Winds and Widowmakers, was the winner of the 2016 Gutman Prize, awarded by the Labor and Working Class History Association. William G. Robbins is Emeritus Distinguished Professor at Oregon State University, where he taught from 1971 until 2002. Following a 4-year stint in the United States Navy, he earned his bachelor's at Western Connecticut University and a PhD in history at the University of Oregon. During his time in graduate school, he worked as a choker setter and as a foreman of fire crews. He taught briefly at Western Oregon University before joining the Oregon State University faculty, where he taught courses in Western American history, Pacific Northwest history, and environmental history. He's published several books, including Lumberjack and Legislators, Political Economy of the Lumber Industry, American Forestry, A History of National, State, and Private Cooperation, Hard Times in Paradise, Coos Bay, Oregon, Colony and Empire, The Capitalist Transformations of the American West, Landscapes of Promise, The Oregon Story, and Landscapes of Conflict, The Oregon Story. Bill is having a couple of issues with his camera today, so he's going to be with us. He's still with us, but he's just going to be off screen. And so now, without further ado, I will turn it over to our panelists. Thanks again to everyone for being here today.
Thank you so much, Heather. Thank you, everyone who's joining us. And thank you, Bill, for agreeing to do this. So for those who aren't familiar with Professor Robbins's work, he is a kind of figurehead in Northwest environmental history, and specifically the history of the timber industry. And I was trying to think, is there one author that I cited more in my book? And if Professor Robbins isn't number one, then he's definitely top 3, just because his long career of research has been really, really helpful to me and was crucial to this book. So thank you, Heather, for that introduction, and thank you, Bill, for agreeing to do this. So anything you want to say, kind of start off, Bill?
No, you ask questions or you make statements, and if it's fitting, I'll respond.
Sorry, say that one more time. Couldn't hear you.
You go ahead and lead the discussion, and if it's appropriate, you want a response from me, or if I see fit to respond, I will do so.
Okay, sounds good. So, I think maybe a good kind of place to start off is kind of what this book is about. And I think the best way to perhaps do that is to discuss the ways in which I got interested in this project in the first place. So I grew up in Chicago, really in the suburbs of Chicago. And I say kind of in the intro to the book, this is a place that is geographically and socioeconomically distant from Pacific Northwest timber country. But right when I was, in high school, starting high school, definitely kind of by the time I graduated high school, that was kind of not necessarily the peak of the spotted owl conflict, but definitely the tail end of the spotted owl conflict. And for those of you who don't know about the spotted owl conflict, it was essentially this really heated debate about forest management and forest use in the Pacific Northwest. Environmentalists had identified the northern spotted owl as a species of concern that was potentially endangered, and they pressed the Forest Service as well as other management agencies for more protections for the bird. And those protections sometimes came at the cost of harvest reductions. And timber workers and rural communities who were, by the late 80s, hanging on by a thread, economically speaking, really resisted. And so a lot of the news stories that got told about the spotted owl conflict were these stories about these bitter, angry workers who didn't care about the environment, fighting to hold on to their job, and these environmentalists who had this kind of forward-thinking ideas about nature. And that was kind of, again, like I said, I grew up in Chicago, and pretty much at the time, all I knew about the Pacific Northwest was, or at least what I knew about the Pacific Northwest timber industry, was through the lens of a lot of that reporting. So eventually I end up, I'm an undergrad, I decide to go to graduate school, and I go to graduate school in the Pacific Northwest. And I kind of had been interested in the timber industry, and I decided, I want to actually write about the timber industry. And the initial story I wanted to start telling was one that very much reflected a lot of the ideas that I had, read about as a teenager in the spotted owl conflict. I was going to tell the story about how, timber workers essentially kind of abandoned their ecological consciousness in favor of jobs. They became kind of this political reactionary, force. So that's the story I initially intended to tell. It just so happens that one of the reasons I decided to go to graduate school in the Pacific Northwest is because I love to fish, and going to graduate school in the Northwest would put me really close to a lot of really great rivers for fishing. So especially in my early days of graduate school, I perhaps spent a little too much time fishing and not enough time reading. But it just so happens that if you fish in the Pacific Northwest, a lot of salmon rivers and steelhead rivers flow through timber towns, and a lot of timber workers fish. So I've ended up meeting a lot of timber workers just on the side of the river, just have kind of informal chats with them. And through a lot of these informal conversations, I realized that a lot of what I thought I knew about timber workers and how they understand their environment and their relationship to the environment was wrong, that they had a more complex relationship to the environment. Yes, they were in a job that harvested lumber, but the way they understood the ecological effects of timber harvests, as well as the way they sometimes understood the need to protect forest ecosystems, was a lot more varied and a lot more nuanced than a lot of the reporting in the spotted owl conflict had given them credit for. So over time, and after enough of these conversations, I kind of realized, there's an interesting environmental and labor history here about the ways in which these ideas about nature and work were created, and then how those played out politically. So ultimately, this book is, it's as much a product of kind of formal archival historical research as it is those riverside conversations. And the story I tell, and ultimately what this book argues, is that, for lack of a better term, or to put it kind of in a very kind of quick shorthand, that timber workers are environmentalists. Not necessarily environmentalists the way many of us think about them, middle-class urban people who enjoy recreating in nature, though that is true of timber workers, at least the recreation part. But really what I argue in this book is that throughout the long history of the timber industry in the Northwest, timber workers have been very concerned, yes, about jobs and about their economic futures, but about the forest where they live, the forest where they hunt and fish and hike and do a lot of kind of outdoor activities, and that we can't understand their history without understanding the multiple ways they think about the forest, and as well as the multiple ways they use the forest. And so ultimately, this book, like I say, takes us through about 120 or so years, starts in about 1900, ends in the present. And like I say, looks at how environmental attitudes among timber workers have emerged, how they changed, how they shaped the union movement of the mid-20th century, and how they shaped kind of environmental conflicts between urban and rural communities in the later 20th century. But the main goal of this book, if there's a political goal of this book, it's to encourage decision makers and policymakers to take seriously the environmental attitudes of people who work in nature. So the spotted owl conflict has, for the most part, declined, but there are still a lot of debates over forest use and land use here in the Pacific Northwest. And sometimes workers can be shut out of those conversations, which creates a host of other political problems. And so really this book is a call for policymakers, for environmentalists, for anyone who cares about the future of forests to really pay attention to timber workers. And one of the things I say in the book, right, is that timber workers don't have all the answers, because no one does. but they spend their lives in the woods, both working in the woods as well as recreating in the woods. And they might have some good ideas about how we can balance our economic need for lumber with our other desires for healthy ecosystems, habitat for animals, and so on and so forth. So that's kind of the general arc of the book. So Bill, I know you kind of at least read some parts of it. Anything you'd want to add about, my arguments or anything like that?
Lots. I said lots.
Well, please go ahead.
Yeah. To begin with, in the late 1980s, just before Judge Dwyer handed down the spotted owl decision, there were, up until 1989, there were record harvests on the national forests and record harvests on Bureau of Land Management lands, to the point that forest supervisors in the various districts across the Northwest were bothered by the level of harvests and beyond any sustainable level. And the two people, and I have written about this, the two people who led the crusade to raise the allowable cut on the National Forest System was Oregon Senator Mark Hatfield, and then one of the Oregon Congressman, Les Aucoin. And those two people were principally responsible not only for that, but then when the first preliminary restrictions on harvests came down, Hatfield attached riders to appropriation. He was chair of the Appropriations Committee, attached riders limiting protests, limiting lawsuits against the Forest Service for the decisions it would make to restrict harvest. That's just one small point. And the other point, just to get to your primary argument about workers in the Northwest lumber industry, and I've been part of that, I think, since the early 1960s, is that it's true that certainly they were conservationists, and I would argue this at the first rate. And the dichotomy, I guess, between what you call an environmentalist or a conservationist, we can all debate, but certainly they were conservationists, and I would fully support that argument. They hunted, they fished, they worked in the forest, they gathered mushrooms, they recreated in the forest, they camped in the forest system and so forth. So that I have no quarrel with. The other part of your thesis is that the spotted owl restrictions dealt only with public lands, as you are well aware, and mainly federal lands, not state lands, and certainly not private lands. So beyond that, restrictions on harvests on state lands depends on state forest policies, state of Oregon, state of Washington, Northern California, where the spotted owl decision had jurisdiction. So those add complexities to the story that you argue. And I don't know, it's a very complex issue, weaving in several different stories, workers who work for companies that simply log private land, and workers who depend on federal or state lands for their timber supply. So those are arguments that will go on far beyond our discussion here this afternoon or this evening.
Yeah. So what you say about the spotted owl conflict being complex, it absolutely is. And that was one of, I think, the biggest challenges of writing this book is, again, as I said, the book covers roughly 120 some years. So the spotted owl necessarily could only be one chapter. And indeed, people have written entire books about just the spotted owl conflict. There's some entire books that don't even cover the entire spotted owl conflict because, as you said, Bill, it's dealing with federal land management. It's dealing with state lands. It is dealing with not just federal lands, but two agencies, the Forest Service and the BLM, which are different parts of, the government. One's Bureau of Interior, one's Bureau of Agriculture. At the same time, too, then you have private lands, you have state legislatures, federal land managers, all these people involved. And again, my goal in this discussion was to bring in workers' perspective Because while other historians and other policy analysts have definitely kind of talked about workers, it's often been in, I don't want to say necessarily simplistic ways, but they don't situate a lot of what was going on in the spotted owl conflict in a much longer history of environmental attitudes among timber workers, and that was kind of my goal. So yeah, it is a very complex history, and my chapter on the spotted owl was probably one of the hardest to write, just because I had to balance the complexity of all these issues and these politics and land management bureaus with the story I wanted to tell about workers. Yeah. So the other thing that you said, Bill, I think is really interesting, and one that, yeah, I kind of glossed over in my introduction there, but I think is worthy of pointing out, is this distinction between environmentalist and conservationist. And anyone who wants to read about kind of that distinction, there is a lot of environmental history where people have kind of, early 20th century, you often see the distinction as articulated as conservationist versus preservationist. And then later in the 20th century, you see this kind of new term, or this new political movement emerge called environmentalism. And oftentimes environmentalism is sometimes juxtaposed with conservationism. And the way historians, and Bill, feel free to jump in here because you've written about this a lot, right? But historians generally define conservationism as the wise use of natural resources. The kind of, it's like Gifford Pinchot, the first chief forester of the U.S., his kind of distinction. And yeah, so that's kind of one of the things that I kind of talk about in the book, or kind of go back and forth on, is kind of conservationist versus environmentalist. Now, most of the timber workers I've spoken with, and Bill, feel free to jump in here too, they define themselves as conservationists. I think that's in part because, especially in the later 20th century, environmentalism took on a certain identity. And this is something I kind of talk about in the book too. An environmentalist was someone who was middle class, who generally worked in a city, who only went into rural nature in order to recreate. I'm not saying that's necessarily a definition I agree with, and indeed, one of the most exciting things in my mind about some of the literature on labor and environmental history of the past 2 decades has been labor historians showing, like, no, actually working people were very environmentally conscious and were part of the environmental movement as well. So yeah, that's one of the reasons I kind of go back and forth on that definition, is because to my mind, they check a lot of the boxes of environmentalists, of thinking about the future, thinking about ecology. On the other hand, they were conservationists, or self-described conservationists in many ways, because they didn't like the political connotations of environmentalism in the later 20th century.
I'd like to
yeah,
go back.
What's Bill?
I'd like to go back for a minute.
Yeah.
To look at the point that I was making earlier about the overcutting of the national forests and the Bureau of Land Management areas, timber holdings during the 1980s. And that was put on by the industry, because the industry had overcut its own land, so they put pressure on the federal government to increase the allowable cut. And so in that respect, the owl is a surrogate for forest management that was pressed by the industry. And I think one point is mentioned in a famous book, Paul Hurt's Conspiracy of Optimism, which argues about the positive attitude of the Forest Service. They could grow trees faster with super trees and so forth, and they could harvests could happen at 30 years and so forth. And they had all these computer projections into the future that all was going to be well. And it hit the fan in the late 1980s with the owl and the overcutting on most of the very productive national forests, 2 of them here in Oregon, the Willamette National Forest and the Siuslaw National Forest. So, and those issues, the driving of public policy was largely the corporations, the companies, the major enterprises looking for more timber to cut. And they had a very heavy influence in what's happening to workers, because workers are subject to what they do and so forth, and their reasoning and so forth, and their value systems and so forth. And that there is a very complex issue in itself, because it intermeshes people from very different walks of life, the workers that I met and interviewed in Coos Bay, the workers that you interviewed in your book. And it's tough. It's a very difficult situation when you have, let's say, the Great Recession in the wood industry in the early 1980s. That shuttered mills and so forth. There was no bird involved in that because the interest rates were high. The construction in Southern California, which is the great bedrock of sending lumber to and so forth, shut down. And all of those issues play into the story as well. And I know that the community I lived in at the time, Paloma, there were log trucks going by where my wife and I lived in 1979, early 1980, and then suddenly none were going by our house. And that's had to do with the closure of mills, the fact that the lumber sales market was in the basket, and it recovered, of course, and into the 1980s, and then experienced some waffling through the spotted owl decision and towards the present. But anyway, that's yours, Steve.
Yeah, so right, absolutely what you're saying is that kind of right before the spotted owl crisis emerges, especially the Willamette National Forest, but all national forests in the Northwest, they were harvesting way too much timber. And kind of one of the things I present in the book is there was kind of a missed opportunity because a lot of workers, especially those who were working on Forest Service land, some of them at least told me that, like, yeah, we thought the cut was too high too. Now, again, this is one of the complexities of conducting oral history, whether they thought that at the time or whether they think that in retrospect, we'll never know. But at the very least, I had timber workers tell me, like, yeah, we kind of understood the cut was too high and things had to be reined in. But this kind of high cut really is or the high kind of timber harvest level is one of the major things that really encourages a lot of environmentalists to start taking seriously the harvest level on national forests, because it was just so alarming. And like I said, there was like this, and that's one of the, I think, the tragedies of the story I tell is that, well, so, to go back in time until, the 1950s, 1960s, one of the things I talk about is how the major union in the timber industry, the International Woodworkers of America, or the IWA, they actually worked in close partnership with the Sierra Club and the Wilderness Society and some of the big environmental organizations to create new wilderness areas, to kind of limit harvests on public lands. And to some extent, they ultimately failed, but attempted to create new rules that would have really limited cuts on even private lands. And so there was this really strong partnership. And for a host of reasons I talk about in the book, that partnership dissolves in the 1970s and 1980s. And so when environmentalists start kind of raising alarms about the high harvest rate on federal lands, workers kind of agree with them, but they can't see themselves as entering into a political partnership with environmentalists. And for that matter, environmentalists can't see themselves as entering into a partnership with rural workers. And it's, I think, one of the great tragedies of, environmental history in Oregon is that you had two groups of people who were thinking along the same lines, who, for all these other social, cultural, and political reasons, just couldn't see one another as allies. And again, I think if there's another message of the book, I hope that that's it, is that, workers and environmentalists can, should, and necessarily must be allies if we're going to protect both, the economic interests of workers as well as, landscapes and ecologies, especially forest ecologies. The other thing you said, Bill, I think that's really important too, is you said the owl is a surrogate. I think that's an important point too, and that's definitely something I talk about in the book as well, is that the opportunities that environmentalists had in order to intervene into Forest Service management were quite limited. There were some laws that they could use, but there weren't a whole lot of laws. Whereas the laws, or especially the Endangered Species Act, which at least in the mid 80s was kind of untested as a piece of environmental policy, they could use that more effectively to limit and reduce harvests on national forests. So Birdie kind of, the bird became like you said, surrogate or kind of useful political and legal tool that environmentalists were able to use. The flip side of that, or the complicated part of that, was then that created a lot of animosity, because the ways in which logging was being limited because of species protection was always in flux, and it created a lot of uncertainty among kind of timber working communities. So
I want to bring up another thing. This is playing devil's advocate, but
by all means,
that environmentalists are all pointy-headed people that come from.
I don't think that, but yeah, go ahead.
But anyway, people that I'm sure you're full aware of, and Alston Chase did this in his book In the Dark Wood, which is a book that I've been highly critical of, and he cites two people, Eric Forsman, the spotted owl scientist, and Jerry Franklin, probably the best known of the ecological foresters and so forth, as being part of a new left cabal, pointy-headed people who come out of this. And I looked at Eric Forsman's background. He grew up in Eugene, Oregon. His mother was a birder, hence how Eric got interested in birds and so forth, and his long quest after he got out of the military in the early 1980s, doing graduate work at Oregon State University and being interested in the spotted owl. And the other one is Jerry Franklin, who grew up in Camas, Washington, and his parents were always camping in the national forests, and he became interested in forestry through that route, and so not having to do anything. And the third person, I'm sure you're well aware of this, is Andy Kerr, who grew up in an impoverished town in Crestwell, Oregon, and went on to college at Oregon State University, never finished, and went off to become, of course, kind of the target for the corporations as being the person who was in back of pushing for the Judge Dwyer decision in 1991. Anyway, that's what I want to put as a playing devil's advocate with your argument.
Yeah. So again, like I said, I don't believe that environmentalists are all kind of affluent, middle-class urbanites who only go into nature to fish, only go into nature to hike and backpack. I don't believe that, because like I said, I think so much really interesting scholarship in the past 20 years has revealed how diverse the environmental movement is and has long been. But what I was saying is, I think a lot of timber workers, especially in the late 20th century, if not till today, tend to have that view of environmentalists. And yeah, the kind of environmentalist coalition, if you will, I think was really complex. And this was also, I think, another challenge of writing the book, and definitely writing that chapter about the spotted owl, was that you had a lot of different people who may have kind of considered themselves environmentalists, who had a lot of different views about environmentalism and how it should function. So I believe I probably mentioned once or twice Jerry Franklin, but I do talk a little bit about Eric Forsman, and he's a fascinating figure. So for those of you who don't know, Eric Forsman was kind of for lack of a better term, the godfather of spotted owl research. Starting in the 70s, he actually started documenting the spotted owl and its kind of habitat requirements and its overall population dynamics. And when he started doing this research in the 70s, the Forest Service, the BLM, game and fish departments in Oregon and Washington, they really didn't care about birds. Essentially, they cared about elk and deer and bear, things that people would hunt. Because that is what brought in revenues through the sale of fishing license. So they were worried about managing those species. And Eric Forsman comes out of this, at the time, relatively new field of ecological science. And he says, hey, if we're going to understand ecosystems, or if we're going to understand the forest as an ecosystem, we got to pay attention to all species, not just the big kind of deer, elk, bear. We have to also look at like birds and salamanders and things like that. So he really focuses on the spotted owl. So, one of the things I say in the book is that, for Forsman, he was definitely concerned about the spotted owl's overall population numbers. And he, along with a lot of other kind of ecological biologists and foresters in the kind of ecological mold, said, hey, we have to start thinking about the forest as an ecosystem. But Franklin and Forsman, they were never really beating the drum for significant harvest reductions. Now, Andy Kerr, was an environmentalist, as Bill said. He, bounced around college a little bit. He comes from Cresswell, but ultimately he kind of finds a home in the burgeoning environmental movement of Corvallis, Eugene, kind of more the kind of new lefty cities of Oregon, the college towns of Oregon, coincidentally. And he's the one who really made, not single-handedly, but his group, the Oregon Natural Resources Council, which now is Oregon Wild, they're the ones who really raised the kind of profile of the bird. And then one of the things he told me, and I thought this was really, really interesting, was he said, in the 80s, the Wilderness Society, the Sierra Club, he said his term was they cared about rock and ice. Essentially, they cared about like high mountain landscapes, and they cared about like these beautiful mountain vistas. They really didn't care much about forests. And that's one of the things he said. Well, he said the owl was essentially a godsend to him. He said that in so many words. And there's actually another famous activist here, Andy Stahl, who famously said, if the spotted owl didn't exist, we would have to invent it. Because essentially raising the profile of the spotted owl was a way to communicate the importance of forests to a lot of people who had never been to Oregon and Washington, and who could, they couldn't wrap their minds around the complexities of old growth forest management, but they could wrap their minds around a cute and cuddly looking little bird. So Kerr and some of those other environmental groups, they very much use the owl as a way to communicate to, people as far away as, New York and Boston, who really don't know much about the forest, but they could understand the plight of an owl.
I want to add a footnote to Andy.
Yeah, by all means.
And for people who are chimed into this session, he had classes with me during his.
You said that blew my mind when you told me that. Yeah.
Oregon State University in the late 1970s, and I think maybe it was too much, and he left school. He never got his degree. Anyway, that is a throwaway line.
No, but it's really, really interesting. He was a really, really interesting figure to talk to. So again, as any historian does, I did my archival research, I looked at my newspapers, but one of the things, at least my favorite forms of research in this book were getting to talk to, some of the people involved in doing oral histories. And Andy Kerr was an interesting guy to talk to. I mean, he was very open and very, I just shot him an email and he's like, oh yeah, sure, come down and talk to me. He currently lives in Ashland, and I went down to Ashland, which for those of you who don't know is kind of Southern Oregon. Had a great, couple-hour conversation with him. I mean, he was very forthcoming and he remembered everything with crystal clarity. I'm trying to think how I want to put this potentially delicately. Some environmentalists I spoke to had some reservations about the way things turned out with the spotted owl conflict, how vitriolic and how acrimonious it became. Struck me that he really didn't. And one of the things Bill said was he kind of is this supersized figure in kind of Oregon political history, and he has the unusual distinction of having been burned in effigy multiple times in multiple rural communities. The newspapers call him like the most hated environmentalist in Oregon. And one of the fun things about talking with him and studying him was he never minced words. He has some really interesting quotes. He was a fun person to quote and write about. But yeah, he was a great person to talk to.
I want to spend just a few minutes talking about raising the issue you addressed about the Northwest Forest Plan.
Mm-hmm.
And I have a good friend in Corvallis who is involved in not writing the Northwest Forest Plan, but actually doing studies every 10 years after the implementation of the Northwest Forest Plan. And it's not true that the Northwest Forest Plan actually shut down all timber harvests on federal forests. In fact, on paper, and this is in lieu of environmental suits that were brought against the Bureau of Land Management and the Forest Service, national forest harvests on both the BLM and the National Forest System were probably going to decline by 2/3. I think that's a rough ratio. That never came to bear, but there have been harvests on Forest Service lands, especially select cutting. And I know some I see on Highway 20 on my trips to Bend, where harvests have been happening just in the last few years. The Bureau of Land Management has proposed different harvests. Some of them have been successful, selective cutting and so forth. But in the large part is that the environmental organizations have brought suit against the BLM and the Forest Service for stopping, getting court injunctions against these harvests, even though they have some scientific credibility to the harvests taking place. And that's one of the problems that has had to do with the shortcomings of the Northwest Forest Plan. In other words, of not living up to its promise of providing certain amounts of timber fiber to communities in the outback. And the other thing I want to mention, and I know you address it in the book, that needs to be mentioned is the role of automation, mechanization, and so forth, making labor as a huge factor in limiting labor as a factor in production. That has happened in the mills, it's happened in the woods, and it's ongoing. And it's something that it's based in the industrial east, it's based in the Northwest woods and in the mills. And then that's a factor that is ongoing as we speak.
Well, automation is a factor in capitalism, right? So why would the Northwest Woods be any different? But yeah, so for those of you who don't know, the Northwest Forest Plan, it was enacted in 1994, but that was President Bill Clinton and his administration's attempt to essentially solve the spotted owl crisis. When Clinton was running for president in 92, he really makes a lot, again, if, for those of you who were alive back then, you can kind of remember, and again, I was young at the time, but even I can sort of recall this, Clinton really was trying to keep the white working class in the Democratic coalition. And so he kind of saw the spotted owl conflict as a way to do that, to kind of appeal both to workers as well as appeal to environmentalists. Clinton himself was a figure who straddled multiple worlds, that, he grew up in a very kind of poor working class rural context in Arkansas. And at the same time, he really, saw himself as a kind of member of the New Left. And that's kind of what he was part of in college. So really, he sees the spotted owl conflict as an opportunity to bridge these divides. And like I said, keep the white working class in the Democratic coalition. So early in his presidency, he convenes a timber summit in Oregon, in Portland. Essentially, workers are invited, timber industry representatives are invited, a lot of people are invited, and they try and hash out some compromise, but ultimately, from that, then Clinton appoints like a board to essentially look for solutions and look for management solutions. And ultimately, the board gave him multiple management solutions. He chooses one that reduces the timber harvest significantly. And I always say, not my quote, but the sign of a good deal is that everyone thinks they got screwed. And that's kind of what the Northwest Forest Plan was, that workers said, oh, this is reducing harvest by way too much. Environmentalists said this is allowing way too much harvest, but it was potentially a way forward. Now, the thing that happens is, kind of what Bill talked about, and I talk about this in the book, is as a result of the spotted owl conflict, the environmental movement really became a lot more litigious, and they learned how to more effectively use the courts to block timber harvests. So a lot of the management, both commercial and non-commercial management strategies that were included as part of the Northwest Forest Plan aren't implemented simply because anytime there's sort of any attempt to actively manage woods, either through commercial harvests or just kind of, non-commercial thinning and stuff like that, the Forest Service gets sued by, environmental groups. And I have some statistic in the book, I can't remember it exactly offhand, but even though, essentially Region 6, which is Washington, Oregon, becomes the subject of like something like 60 or 70% of all Forest Service litigation. So a lot of these plans can't be implemented that would have maybe allowed for more harvest at the same time, creating a lot more kind of ecologically healthy forest. And the other thing that was part of the Northwest Forest Plan was there were supposed to be these job retraining programs and monies set aside for rural counties and rural communities that really needed them. And for a host of political, social, and cultural reasons, these programs aren't administered or as funded as well as they should be. So again, this is kind of another sad part of the story, is that potentially the Northwest Forest Plan was a plan that would have allowed for both ecologically healthy forests and economically healthy rural communities, but for a host of political reasons, Oh yeah, go ahead, Bill.
Let me interject. First, the passage from Bill Clinton, this is out of your book, and I quote, "We must never forget the human and economic dimensions of these problems," end quote. The other is that Congress did pass a Rural Schools Act that applied to forested regions in Oregon, Washington, California, and actually in the East as well, for successive years. I mean, it went on for 10, 15, 20 years, and I think it's redundant now. I mean, it's no longer exists. But that is one response to the promise. Obviously, it didn't put enough money into communities, but it did provide some saving grace for support of public schools and timber-dependent communities.
Yeah, so right, the Save the Rural Schools Act, I can't remember exactly when it was passed, but it was an attempt to funnel some money into hard-hit rural counties, not just in the Northwest.
It was 4 or 5 years after the Northwest.
But that was never really funded as well as it needed to be. And yeah, it kept some public schools in rural communities from closing, but those schools certainly didn't thrive as a result of the SRS. Yeah, and that's kind of one of the larger issues here is that, yeah, and again, it goes back to the complex dynamics of timber sharing payments in rural counties, which I think we're about ready for the Q&A to start. So we don't have time to go into that because that's a really complicated issue. But yeah, I mean, essentially one of the things I talk about in the book is that, there were all these missed opportunities where things might have gone a different way. The Northwest Forest Plan was one of them. Potentially the Secure Rural Schools Act was another one. And for a host of political, social, cultural reasons, they didn't. So.
Yeah, so it looks like we do have one question that has come in. So feel free to start putting in other questions. But you touched on this a little bit already, but if there's anything else you wanted to say about. So someone asks, what about the role of automation and industry consolidation? Small profitable mills in rural communities were bought and shut down by the big lumber corporations because their margins weren't big enough.
Yeah, so undeniably, automation and mechanization is part of the story of the economic troubles that the rural Northwest encounters in the late 20th century. Mills became far more automated, they needed less labor, and that creates a lot of unemployment. One of the things I suggest in the book, though, is that automation, I think, to some extent has been overstated as a cause of economic problems in the rural Northwest. And there actually is some research showing that automation didn't have the same effect or the same detrimental effect that a lot of people at the time said it did. At the time, I mean, kind of 80s, 90s. That's not to say it had no effect. It just wasn't this kind of massively kind of economically dislocating effect. So automation has to be part of the conversation. However, one of the things one of the problems I see, and this is something I talk about in the book, is that, oftentimes evoking automation is a way to shift the conversation away from the economic impact of environmental policy. And we may say we want stricter laws regarding harvest, we want stricter laws that protect endangered species like the spotted owl. And that's fine. But then a lot of times, especially in the 80s and 90s, environmentalists said, oh, environmental policy is not causing any problems. It's all automation. So like I say, I'm a firm believer that automation plays a role. But one of the problems is that automation was also used as a rhetorical tool to shift conversation away from the culpability that environmentalists and people pressing for more environmental protections might have had and maybe should have had for creating alternative economic opportunities for peoples impacted by environmental policy.
I want to respond to the question the person asked about consolidation in the industry. That occurred actually in the early 1980s. A lot of rural mills closed, there was consolidation in the industry. I don't know what the statistics are, but they were massive. And even here in Benton County, where I live, there were closures of mills everywhere, small mills, and consolidation underwent. And a University of Oregon sociologist, his last name is Weeks, and I can't remember his first name, did a study of this, and it was kind of a bloodless, betting of the industry in terms of consolidation and the disappearance of small mills out in the countryside. Those were gone by 1985, 1986, when the industry was restructured and consolidated.
Yeah. So one of the things that happens though, and I talk about this in the book, and this was, I think, one of my more interesting findings, is that at the same time this kind of consolidation is going on, the really big timber companies, among them Weyerhaeuser, they're not making as much money from actually harvesting timber. Essentially, for a host of financial reasons that I detail in the book, the land became more valuable than the actual timber on it. And so a lot of these companies, they reorganize as essentially real estate management companies, and they start selling off big parcels of their land to real estate developers, which creates a host of problems. And then this gives rise to this other phenomenon called independent contract logging, more popularly known as JIPO logging. So essentially you get these kind of complex, class dynamics that start emerging in the late 20th century, which impacts the ways in which the spotted owl conflict and subsequent industry conflicts have played out as well.
I want to add that land becomes more valuable for recreative activities or real estate investments. That doesn't work in Oregon.
Oh, what do you mean it doesn't work in Oregon?
Because of the Land Use and Conservation Act, Tom McCall's legislation protecting forest land and agricultural land.
Right. So McCall's policies in the LCDC.
Yeah, because Oregon is different.
But some of this stuff actually starts to happen before Bill 100 is passed.
That's 1973.
Yeah, and then some of this stuff starts to happen before that. And at the same time, you're starting getting, and this happens maybe a little bit later, but you start getting kind of rural gentrification as timber towns lose their industry. They start drawing in kind of a more affluent set of people. This is true of like cities like Bend and Hood River. And kind of same thing is that, yeah, they're not necessarily buying timberland up in like large parcels, but there's kind of these new economic changes and these new demographic changes that are part and parcel to essentially the real estate kind of shift really starts bringing in, essentially refashions Oregon in a way.
Yeah, I have no quarrel with that. But what my point is that the forest-based, anything that is primary forest land is still primary forest land. And anything that is primary agricultural land is still primarily agricultural land. And for anyone who questions that, I advise you to take an air flight over the Willamette Valley, and then take an air flight over the valley in southern Idaho by Boise, and you see 5-acre ranchettes everywhere. You don't see that in Oregon.
Oh yeah, so right. Tom McCall's land use planning system is a whole nother kind of fascinating chapter of Oregon history. So yeah, you're absolutely right, is that once it was zoned forest land, it had to remain forest land. But the issue is that timber companies weren't necessarily harvesting as much lumber. So again, Weyerhaeuser as an example, and for those who don't know, Weyerhaeuser is like the long-standing kind of giant of the timber industry here in the Northwest. They're not actually now organized as a timber company. Yes, they still harvest timber, but they are actually organized as something called a real estate investment trust, or a REIT. And essentially that allows them to manage their lands as more a real estate investment than a kind of industrial commodity. So essentially, as the ownership strategies change, that impacts private land harvests, which then impacts public land harvests.
There are a lot of REITs in Oregon too, not just Weyerhaeuser, but
I just use Weyerhaeuser as the example because they're the ones.
A lot of Wall Street companies investing in real estate investment trusts. But the point is, they can skin the land then too in harvests, and they have, and that's been a big point in the last 15 or 20 years in the state of Oregon. But that's beyond your book.
Certainly has, yes. Are there any other questions, Heather?
Not right now. So if there's other topics you guys wanted to talk about, we still have a few minutes left.
So again, we've only talked about like the last 2 chapters of the book so far. I would just add there's 8 chapters in the book, and there's 6 that come previous, starting with the rise of the timber industry in the early 20th century and how it changed, like the people who initially came to work in the industry and how they essentially organized labor unions, but also how they kind of live their day-to-day lives. So yeah, I should point out for anyone listening, right, is that the book is not just about the spotted owl conflict. A lot of the book is moving towards that, but I like to think there's a lot of other interesting things going on in the book as well. Do you have anything to add, Bill, or anything we didn't talk about that we should?
Yeah, but we discussed innovation in labor and technology and so forth as a reduction in labor. And I would just remind people who are tuning into our discussion that the most dramatic, by far the most dramatic innovations in removing labor as a matter in the world of production is the introduction of the chainsaw following World War II. That was enormous, and especially the development of mechanical yarding machines. In other words, they're doing away with the steam donkeys and so forth. And that reduced labor in a huge way, very dramatically. And of course, it occurred at a time when, in the post-war years, there was an incredible demand for lumber, saw lumber. Huge, the most expansive building projects ever occurred in this century, in this country, occurred in the years following the Second World War. And if you look at the top year for lumber production in terms of board feet in the state of Oregon, it takes place in 1955, 1956, not in years afterwards.
Yeah, absolutely. So, right. Yeah, I'm glad you said that, Bill, that technological innovation is not unique to the late 20th century. This is part of the story of any industry, but especially the timber industry. So yeah, Bill, you talked about the chainsaw, you talked about, so yeah, for those of you who don't know, Bill said mechanical yarding. Yarding is the process of once a tree has been felled and it's on the kind of forest floor, how do you get it off the forest floor and load it onto a kind of either a train or a truck and sent to the mill? That's actually a really complex process. The other thing I would add too is in the post-war period is that replacing rail lines with roads. I think that was also a really significant impact that actually allowed the timber industry to reach into places where it previously was unable to go. But yeah, as you say, the kind of effect on employment of automation in the mid 20th century wasn't noticed as much, only because the harvest was so high. So yeah, while it ended some jobs, essentially the jobs created by the kind of post-war boom in lumber really kind of has a net overall employment effect. So
I have just a minor quibble with what you said, that that trucks allowed lumbermen or loggers to get into areas where they couldn't. Actually, logging railroads went into incredible places.
Oh, and, yeah, no, they absolutely were. Yeah. But building a logging road or building a gravel road was a lot easier than building a...
Yeah, and it allowed smaller capital enterprises to invest in stuff like that. During the 1950s, the heyday of the Chippewa logger and, the Ken Kesey's Sometimes a Great Notion, the Stamper family, that you point out in the book, never give an inch.
Yeah. So right, that's one of the other things that I do in the book is I kind of, for those of you who know Jefferson Cowie's work, especially his book Staying Alive about the 70s. I was really inspired by that book and kind of try to do kind of what Cowie does for the white working class broadly, talking about kind of how culture reshapes the image or idea of the working class in people's mind. I try to do that with the Northwest Woods. So I talk about a lot of cultural products that come out of the Northwest and that are reframing images of loggers. One of them being Ken Kesey's, some would say famous, in the book I suggest infamous book, Sometimes a Great Notion, and how it reshaped the way a lot of people understood loggers and who they were. So yeah, there's also a kind of cultural history element to this whole story that I try and bring to bear on it.
All right, well, it looks like we're almost out of time. Do you have any final thoughts or any thoughts about what you would want readers to take away after reading your book, the main takeaway?
The main takeaways are kind of what I already said, is that, try and put aside what you think you know about timber workers and how they understand their relationship to the environment, and actually listen to what they have to say. And I think once we do, we find that there's more opportunities for bringing working people into conversations about how we manage the forest. And when we do that, that might lead us to a path of land use management that is far less angry and far more productive. And I think protecting, one of the big takeaways of the books is that protecting rural communities and protecting forests do not have to be mutually exclusive endeavors, that we can do both, but doing both requires some shifts in thinking. So that's maybe one of the big takeaways of the book, is that we don't have to choose between healthy rural communities and healthy forests, is that we can certainly have both.
Well said.
Thanks, Bill.
Well, thank you both so much. It's been a very interesting conversation. For anyone listening, if you'd like to purchase a copy of the book and learn more, you can use promo code HOLIDAY22 and get 50% off. That sale is going on through December 31st. So make sure to head over to our website and check it out. And we will be recording this event, should be up tomorrow. So thank you again, everyone, and have a wonderful evening.
Great. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.